The goal of this video is to discuss autism self-diagnosis, and in particular, to discuss common concerns or objections that are raised regarding self-diagnosis. But before that, I wanted to take a little bit of an unusual detour and start with a hypothetical scenario that's designed to illustrate the potential drawbacks of a strict diagnostic threshold. You can imagine this alternate universe where a perfect autism screening tool has been developed, or at least as perfect as such a tool can be. So it's free, it's available to everyone. It works optimally on people of all ages, all backgrounds, etc. If you take the tool, you'll get a score at the end that's between 0 and 100, and the score accounts for your autistic traits, any internal experiences that you might have as well. So if you're suppressing an autistic trait, the tool will account for that. It accounts for the variety of different ways that traits can present, and so on. And all of this boils down to one number. So if your score is, let's say, above 50, you're autistic, and if it's below 50, you're non-autistic, based on the way that autism is defined in this world. So firstly, that would be really neat. It would be very helpful for a lot of people for their self-understanding, and it would definitely be a much cheaper option than the current diagnostic process. But even still, I think there's cases where the technical diagnostic status of someone might be less important than their overall support needs. So to illustrate that, we can imagine that there's two people with pretty much the exact same personality, exact same set of autistic traits, more or less, and similar life experiences. And the only difference is that the second person has just slightly more typical eye contact than the first person, maybe by like 5% or so. Otherwise, they're essentially identical. The first person takes the assessment and gets a score of 50, so they're autistic. The second person takes the assessment and gets a score of 49.999, so very marginally below the threshold. And technically, that person would be non-autistic because, after all, it's a perfect tool. There's no room for error. The classification is completely correct. But it also might not matter that much practically. After all, these two people have so much in common. They're designed by the hypothetical fictitious nature of our case study to be essentially the same person. And so they would have very similar support needs. If the first person finds an autism discussion group helpful and supportive, very likely the second person would as well. If the first person needs an accommodation, very likely the second person would as well. Even though, technically speaking, the first person would be autistic and the second person would be non-autistic. And if both of them, prior to taking this assessment, had self-identified as autistic, technically the first person would be correct and the second person would be incorrect. But in practice, both of them likely would have found a similar amount of self-understanding and helpful resources from the autistic community because they are so similar overall. So with that out of the way, the reason for bringing that up, other than just my personal interest in thresholds and optimization problems, is because I do think that accuracy is important. I think that looking at research on that is useful, and I'm going to describe a little bit of that in a minute. But I think that the most important questions regarding self-diagnosis are really, what are the practical benefits and drawbacks to self-identification? I think that becomes especially important in the real world, where we don't have a perfect tool that can take into account not only what a clinician can observe in a limited interaction with someone, but cannot take into account the full set of experiences the person's had over their life, how much they might be hiding, or suppressing certain autistic traits, and so on. So accuracy, I think, does become much harder to assess in the real world. Start with some potential benefits, and then I'm going to move on to the potential drawbacks or concerns, and I'm going to try and discuss those in as much good faith as possible. My own perspective is that self-diagnosis is very beneficial, but I really want to address objections to it in a serious and hopefully respectful way as well. So the first benefit, I think, is really, it's almost a double negative. It's that the absence of exclusion. If we don't include self-identified autistic individuals in the autistic community and autism research, etc., we're excluding quite a few autistic people. There are going to be many autistic individuals who do not currently have or may never receive a formal diagnosis of autism, and that could be for a lot of different reasons. One is that diagnosis can be really expensive. It can be up to a couple $1,000s in the United States at least, and that's a lot to spend. Especially, there's also other barriers that I think may be less frequently discussed. For example, some diagnostic centers still require family reports to get a sense of what someone was like during early childhood, and you can imagine that if a much older autistic individual is seeking a diagnosis, they may not have parents alive or parents who would be able to provide a detailed description of their childhood for the assessor. There's also people who might not be in contact with their family for a variety of different reasons. And then there's also several different diagnostic disparities. We know that autistic women, autistic individuals from underrepresented cultural backgrounds, and most likely autistic individuals who are underrepresented for any reason, are less likely to receive an autism diagnosis, or if they do receive it, often receive it much later in life. So yeah, so to describe the practical impact of that, even if you're able to do a study that compares different different scores between formally diagnosed and self-identified autistic individuals, for example, repetitive movements. If your definition of repetitive movement is based solely on things like rocking back and forth or flapping one's hands, etc., you might be overlooking very real instances of repetitive behavior that can be especially common in underrepresented groups. So, for example, some autistic women have stated that they would twirl with kind of twirl jewelry or beads on a bracelet repetitively, or would twirl their hair repetitively, things that were considered a little bit more socially acceptable. And these types of repetitive behavior might fly under the radar, therefore artificially lowering someone's score. And there's probably as well. Of course, the exact expression of someone's repetitive behavior is going to vary a lot from person to person, regardless of their gender. The second potential benefit is increased self-understanding. We know from research that self-identified autistic individuals do have a lot in common with formally diagnosed autistic individuals, and generally fit the autism criteria quite well. One study that was called an exploratory study of a dimensional assessment of the diagnostic criteria for autism found that self-identified and formally diagnosed autistic individuals did not have any significant difference between the two groups regarding social communication. With restricted and repetitive behaviors, the formally diagnosed autistic group did have a somewhat higher level of restrictive and repetitive behaviors, but it's also worth noting that both the self-identified and formally diagnosed groups had higher levels of restrictive and repetitive behaviors than the non-autistic groups in that study. And other studies have found that there's a lot of shared experiences between the self-identified and formally diagnosed autistic individuals. So a separate study found that there were very similar, I think the exact wording they used was strikingly similar scores in stigma and quality of life. There's a lot of similar barriers to employment, for example. So I think those research studies give some indication that self-identified individuals are likely to greatly benefit from being connected to the autistic community and being provided with resources for autistic individuals. But even beyond research studies, I know anecdotally that many autistic individuals found it a great relief to realize later in life, with or without a formal diagnosis, that they were autistic. That realization can help someone understand all these behaviors that were just perceived as strange or unusual, or maybe shameful before that. And now not only does it make much more sense and have a name and kind of give you a starting point to find more information, but it can also connect you to a community of people with similar experiences, which is especially beneficial if you're someone who has experienced a lot of social stigma and isolation throughout your life. So with those benefits discussed out of the way, I wanted to focus primarily on objections that I've heard against self-diagnosis. And the main one is the question of, well, what if someone's just wrong? Can't it be the case that someone is incorrect about whether they're autistic or not? In that case, could it lead them away from self-understanding rather than leading them towards self-understanding? Or could it even cause misconceptions about what autism is? And I do think that it's theoretically possible that someone is wrong about a self-diagnosis or self-identification. I also think it's possible that clinicians might be giving false negatives at times. So the question of whether a self-diagnosis is more likely to be wrong than a formal diagnosis, I'm not entirely sure of. My guess is that autism is something that's relatively easy to identify accurately. I think that the studies above it indicate that a little bit. But also the fact that the criteria are things which are relatively easy for most people to know about themselves, autistic or not. I think most people have a pretty good sense of whether their social communication is, significantly different than what's typical or not. I think most people have a pretty good sense of whether they find change in routine to be very disruptive. It's a little bit like, and I'm not an expert in anxiety or psychology, but I think most people, whether or not they've been formally assessed by a clinician, have a pretty good sense of whether they have elevated anxiety or not. And if someone is having panic attacks and they recognize that about themselves, they're likely to be quite accurate, even if a clinician has never formally diagnosed that. But yes, I do think that in general, it's possible for someone to be technically wrong about being autistic, especially if they have a condition that has some overlap. For example, if someone has schizoid personality disorder, some of the social differences there could be mistaken either by themselves or by a clinician for autistic traits. And in those cases, it could potentially lead someone away from self-understanding, but not necessarily. In some cases, it could mean that the person is at least able to connect with others who have somewhat shared traits, even if it's not exactly the same. It could lead them down a path where they are learning more about neurodivergence, and at the end, they might have learned more about autism as part of their mental health diagnostic journey, and then finally learn more about whatever type of neurodivergence they finally realize that they do have. I think how can we make sure that any potential false positives are as non-harmful as possible? My guess would be to promote information about all different types of neurodivergence. If people are only seeing information about autism and ADHD, they might naturally assume, if they have some type of undiagnosed neurodivergence or unidentified neurodivergence, they might naturally assume that they have whichever those two categories best fits their neurodivergent traits or experiences. Whereas if there was information about all different types of neurodivergence available, they would be able perhaps to realize like, oh, okay, my experiences match this particular part of autism, but don't seem to really fit it completely. I think that this other condition describes it much better. With that said, for many of these descriptions, if someone feels fully supported and helped by resources related to autism, if they find the autistic community very helpful, if their accommodation needs are very similar to autistic individuals, and so reading about potential accommodations is very useful for them, even if they were secretly having a different type of neurodivergence the whole time without realizing it and without anyone else realizing it, I would say practically it doesn't matter as long as they're being helped. So in what cases would it potentially be useful for an outsider to intervene and suggest that the person has another type of neurodivergence? I think that's a really interesting question. I would imagine that the relatively few cases where that would be beneficial would be if someone is indicating that, signs of something like psychosis or another condition that could really benefit from quick and efficient treatment. And in that case, it probably might not be worth trying to convince the person that they're not autistic, because after all, they could be autistic very well. They could be autistic and also have this other thing. But it might be important, if you're very close to the person or if you're treating them, obviously, to point out that they might want to consider other things as well. That autism, even if you are autistic, that doesn't necessarily explain every experience you're going to have. And second objection, which I think has a similar flavor to this, is what if someone uses a self-diagnosis as an excuse? What if someone is not really autistic and they say that they're autistic in order to get extra accommodations? Well, one question or kind of response I have to that is, what if an autistic person uses their diagnosis as an excuse? For example, I'm autistic. I have a formal diagnosis of autism. I'm not currently a student anymore, but when I was, I did not need extra time on tests. That's just one accommodation that personally I didn't need. If I were to somehow ask for that accommodation just in order to get a better score, the fact that I have a formal diagnosis of autism would not mean that it wasn't an excuse. I think these are the types of accommodations that people are often worried about being taken advantage of. On the other hand, you could have someone who maybe is self-identified as autistic, and maybe even if they're not actually autistic, they could genuinely really benefit from that accommodation. Even if it turns out that their self-identification of autism was wrong, maybe they have ADHD, or maybe they have another condition where it's really helpful for them to have extra time on a test. And so I think, again, the key issue here is not necessarily focusing on whether the specific label of autism is accurate or not, but figuring out ways to make sure that people are getting the accommodations they need. I do think it's quite unlikely that people are going to be asking for accommodations that they don't need. It's much more likely that people would probably be afraid or hesitant to bother others, or might be worried about how their employer or professor is going to react to requests for accommodations. But if there is that concern at all, oftentimes there's a way to set things up so that everyone in the class can benefit equally. For example, you could have a test where everyone has the option of extra time. Most people won't use it because most people won't benefit from it. And for many of us, if we were to go extra time, we might just start second guessing our answers, and it would almost make things even worse. But to the extent that that's a concern, there is often a way to make accommodations more readily available to everyone, which would kind of level the playing field for those who are worried about the possibility of someone using it as an excuse, and would have the added benefit of more people being able to access accommodations easily. Sometimes this also comes up in interpersonal relationships where people might feel, I think there's sometimes this concern that if someone's autistic, that they might start expecting special treatment. And again, I think that this is not very likely to happen. But to the extent that it were to happen, it's not really an issue of someone having an incorrect self-diagnosis. It's a question of, regardless of whether someone really is autistic or not, we wouldn't want to accept harmful behavior from them. Autism, overrepresentation of self-identified autistic individuals might mean that people with higher support needs are left out. So to begin with, I think this is often based on the assumption that if someone's diagnosed later in life, that they are somehow less autistic, or that they have lower support needs. And this may not necessarily be true. I found one research article, because I genuinely didn't know if there was research on this, and if so, what it showed. One research article I think had particularly interesting results. They found that they looked at the experiences of formerly diagnosed and or undiagnosed, but later diagnosed autistic children starting at age 5. And they found that at age 5, those who were diagnosed earlier had, I guess, like more visible autistic traits. They had more emotional, I guess, dysregulation, I assume, hyperactivity, social challenges, and so on. And those who were going to be diagnosed later at age 5 also had many of those traits, but to a lesser degree. The part that I find particularly compelling here is that when they followed these people over time, they found that there was a faster yearly increase in certain, I guess, challenges among those who were self-identified compared to those who had received an earlier diagnosis. And it looks like by age 14 years, those who were, I'm sorry, I'm misspeaking. Those who had not yet received a diagnosis, whether they're self-identified or just didn't know they were autistic yet and were going to receive a diagnosis later in life. But regardless, those who were autistic and did not have a formal diagnosis by age 14 had higher levels of emotional challenges and some other challenges as well compared to those who had been diagnosed earlier. So to me, this indicates that not only can we not automatically assume that those who are self-identified or identify later in life have lower support needs, we also probably should take into account the fact that a delayed diagnosis itself or delayed understanding itself can actually induce higher support needs in certain areas. It might mean that someone's been unaccommodated in one area for a really long time and perhaps has built up more emotional distress, for example. With that said, I do think that there is a very urgent issue in the autistic community that is not at all in conflict with self-diagnosis or self-identification, but that separately very much needs to be considered, which is that people with intellectual disabilities are often very, very much underrepresented, and people with certain other co-occurring conditions as well. And I think making sure that those individuals are given their rightful place in the autistic community and that those experiences are understood better is extremely important. So that really concludes my sort of thoughts on self-diagnosis, self-identification. Thank you very much for listening, and take care.